Hello, I'm Tom Parker, and welcome to Voices from the CEPS Ideas Lab. In this episode, I spoke with Vasileios Rizos. Vasileios is a senior research fellow and heads the Energy, Resources and Climate Change Unit, and is also head of Sustainable Resources and Circular Economy at CEPS. During our interview, we discussed circular economy policies in Europe and what needs to happen to turn our predominantly linear economies into circular ones. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Thanks, Tom. My name is Vasileios Rizos, and I'm head of the Energy, Resources and Climate Change Unit of CEPS.
Vasileios, pleasure to have you here. Thanks for giving us some of your time.
Thanks for the invite.
Look, I want to talk about the circular economy. How has the EU circular economy policy mix been evolving over the recent years?
That's a very broad question. So maybe we can start from the basics that,
Sure.
If you look into global policy developments in recent years, there has been, a realization that basically meeting our very ambitious decarbonization objectives by 2050 will just not going to be possible only with marginal improvements in the way we deal with resources, energy and material resources.
Yeah.
So basically we need a transformation. This is a word that is used very often, transformation. What does this mean? Basically means that Europe needs to change the way the economy functions and move into, let's say, a different system, a different economic system, pretty much. Now, that's long been debated. It's maybe not something necessarily new, but what we've seen the last 10 years is that basically Europe has taken the path of transforming its policy mix on resource efficiency and waste, because previously, let's say there was a lot of focus on waste and resource efficiency. So there was, let's say, a more ambitious, strategy in terms of how we deal with policies related to circular economy. And actually, we've seen really a long series of legislative and non-legislative actions during the past 10 years. Actually, we had 2 circular economy action plans published by the European Commission and 90 legislative and non-legislative actions. So as you can imagine, we're talking about a long list of actions that have resulted in a very rich, if I can use this word, rich policy mix on the circular economy. So I think that and Europe is often quoted as having the most comprehensive or the most ambitious policy mix on circular economy in the world, and I think that holds some merit. Of course, if we go into the details, there are always things that can be improved, gaps that we can talk about them later. But generally, in terms of covering the all stages of product's life cycle, and on the degree of ambition, I would say that we're pretty high, if not the highest now in the world, in terms of policy action at least.
And is it working though? You said you've got all of these 90 legislative, non-legislative policies that are there. Is it working? Or are we still too reliant on a take, make, waste, linear economy?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and we already go into the difficult kind of part of the discussion, and I think this is fair. If we look into different statistics and data, in the end we have to look into monitor frameworks and stuff. Basically, we have been doing well in terms of improving our recycling rates in Europe. So basically, we have established good collection systems in most member states. Okay, in most member states, not all of them. We have diverted a lot of waste that used to end up in landfills. So we have been doing well in that respect. And for certain waste streams, collection rates have improved. Now, going into this holistic framework is a more complex discussion. And there is one indicator in Eurostat, circular material rate, which basically it measures the amount of resources that are taken back into the economy, and which covers a big part of the circular economy, not all of it though, a big part of the circular economy. And there we know that the current rate is 11.5%. So it's not as high maybe as some people would expect, and actually if you look into the progress in recent years, it hasn't improved as much as people expected.
Okay.
But that's linked to the point that some of these actions need time to see the effect. So, and sometimes people are impatient, including me, let's say. Yeah.
And so there must be challenges to getting fully into a circular economy. What are some of the biggest challenges there?
One of the biggest challenges that is discussed a lot now in Brussels refers to how can we create a market, a really well-functioning market for circular products and materials, basically. And that market, to a large extent, doesn't exist yet. That has been actually recognized by a lot of important publications in recent years, including last year, including the LETA and the Draghi report. So basically, if you look into the EU, we have issues that have prevented the development of this market so far. We have different waste classification systems. So basically, the language we use for products that have reached the end of their life cycle is not the same across member states. And we've seen this at CEPS when we did a study on waste wood. So basically, the way waste wood is defined in different member states is different currently in the EU. Just to pick up one example. Then the cost of recycling sometimes is too high. The economic incentives are not there yet. Investments on recycling sometimes are missing. We haven't seen, let's say, the full scale of investments that we expect to see. I mean, in terms of the market, I think these are some of the challenges. And allow me to say that if you look into the history of European policy on circular economy, there has been a lot of focus on the supply side. Mm-hmm. So basically, there have been policies to really target, the supply side of things. Now, to give some examples, extended producer responsibility is one example. An obligation for producers to set up systems for the management of products. Collection targets or recycling targets. We had these measures in place for quite some time, but there needs to be some more emphasis on the demand side as well. How do we actually bring the incentives on the plates for these, let's say, solutions, to scale up in Europe? We need economic incentives. We need maybe to go into a more ambitious route in the way we procure things, because the state is the largest purchaser in the market. So maybe so far we had a voluntary approach in this regard. Maybe we need to basically go into a more ambitious, even mandatory approach on green public procurement. And other measures that we have had on demand, for example, labels, they have had an effect, but maybe there's a need for more push on this side, if you understand what I mean. And then there's also the question of leakage of secondary raw materials. By the way, by secondary raw materials, I mean materials that have been, in a way, recycled and be reintroduced or they are to be reintroduced in the economy. Metals, for example, or plastics. Now, if you look into metals, there's a lot of export of scraps outside the EU, and of course there are concerns by the industry that we may miss some resources for our own clean development technology in Europe. For other resources like plastics, we don't have enough secondary raw material because the incentives are not there. So as you can see, the challenges are also different per different material streams.
Well, I want to go back to the supply side. Are there particular industries that are doing much better when it comes to moving away from the linear economy to a circular economy?
Yeah, if you look,
are they doing anything different to what some of our other industries are doing? Or is their industry particularly just positioned to do better than others? Yeah,
it will be difficult to provide a ranking. I think that would be unfair for some people, but I think for some industries. But if you look into some, the statistics, there are some material streams for which we have good, let's say, recycling rates. One example is aluminium, for example. Yeah. And then on the other hand, as I explained, plastics is an example where not a lot is recycled, and textiles is another example that now we have a strategy to collect textiles in Europe, and I think we will develop scale in terms of collection. But the question is, do we have the technologies in place to recycle these textiles? And in many cases we don't. And that is linked to the incentives I mentioned later, to the investments on recycling technologies that we sometimes miss. So really the push to move from solutions on a lab scale to, let's say, to market scale and on a massive scale, because that's what we need to transform the European economy, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay, so if you, before we leave, had a sort of 30-second hopeful, what has to be done, what would be your call to action for that?
I think that in general, what the Commission intends to do, which is to publish a Circular Economy Act in 2026, is on the right track. It's going to address some of these issues related to demand. So we are curious, and we as CEPS, we're going to provide inputs, of course, to this process on instruments that can drive demand. But then you'll give me 2 seconds to discuss about an elephant in the room, which is, of course, consumption. And we still, to be fair, there's still a lot of focus in Europe on recycling. Yeah. And even the measures I mentioned earlier, like secondary raw materials, recycling of secondary raw materials, it's still a lot is about recycling. But we need to look into consumption, and we produce a lot of waste still. We had production of waste per capita was 5 tons in 2022, so it's pretty high. We produce 17.6 kilograms per e-waste. Every European citizen produces 17.6 kilograms per waste each year. So we have the highest rate actually globally. So It is quite a high rate. So we need to look into the consumption side of things. So I would say that in the long run, we will need maybe a different, even a more ambitious mixture of policies that will also address consumption.
Okay, well, actually, before I let you go, because you've raised an important thing here, when you're looking at the consumption of it and addressing the engagement with public to say, I want to choose this particular product over this particular product because of how it's been made, is there more of an impact that can happen there, or do you think it's in the supply? Do you think it's in the making of it? Where do you see some of the best push and pull?
I would say both. If you look into some of the important streams, for example, electronics, there has been a segment of consumers that is really, this pays attention on, sustainability. Or sometimes it just makes sense financially, to buy a refurbished phone or a refurbished device, which still functions well. So there is, let's say, there are things happening on the demand side, and the consumer segment is shifting preferences, but we need to look into supply as well, certainly. And, we had a session yesterday on sufficiency here at CEPS, which actually argues that at some point we need to see how we can put in place measures that can actually reduce demand for resources and stuff. I know it's a complex discussion, maybe we can have another podcast, but I think it's worth consideration in the future.
Well, we absolutely do need more time on it, but this is all the time we have today. So Vasileios, thank you very much for speaking to me, and take care.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.